The distance between hope and humiliation is measured not in miles but in moments, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, in the terrible silence that falls across a crowded ballroom when a woman realizes she has been made a fool before everyone she has ever known. Eleanor Ashworth understood this truth with the intimacy of one who had lived it, who carried it still like a stone lodged beneath her ribs, and on this autumn evening, 2 years after her world had shattered, she sat alone in a modest rented room in an unfashionable corner of London, while rain lashed against the window glass and thunder rolled across the grey sky like a pronouncement of judgment. The storm outside seemed a fitting companion to the tempest of memory that would not release her, no matter how firmly she told herself that the past was done and dwelling upon it served no purpose. For even now she could close her eyes and find herself transported back to that midsummer ball, to the glittering chandeliers and the strains of a waltz and the rustle of silk gowns, to the moment when Lord Clarence Pemberton had approached her with an expression she had mistaken for tenderness, but which she now recognized as the particular satisfaction of a man about to rid himself of an inconvenience. She remembered the golden arrangement of his hair, the pale blue of his eyes that never quite warmed even when he smiled, the softness of his hands that had never known labor, and she remembered, too, how those hands had gestured dismissively as he spoke loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear every devastating syllable. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," he had said, and even now the words echoed through her memory with crystalline cruelty. "I cannot possibly marry a woman whose family will bring me nothing but creditors at my door. Surely you understand, Miss Ashworth. I must think of my future." The faces of the watching crowd had blurred into a sea of avid eyes and barely concealed whispers, and Eleanor had heard nothing but the thunder of her own heartbeat as Clarence turned his back and walked away, leaving her standing alone in her beautiful gown that had been purchased on credit they could no longer afford. Now, in her small room with its worn carpet and single window, Eleanor's fingers rose unconsciously to touch the small crescent-shaped scar at the corner of her left eyebrow, a habit so ingrained she rarely noticed she did it, and she straightened her spine despite there being no one present to witness her posture, for dignity was all she had remaining, and she would not relinquish it, even in solitude. Her father had died 3 months after that terrible night, an apoplexy brought on, she privately believed, by the shame of their ruin and her public humiliation, and her mother had been gone for years before that, leaving Eleanor entirely alone in a world that had no place for a gentlewoman without fortune or prospects. Love, she had concluded in the bitter months that followed, was a luxury she could not afford, a beautiful illusion that existed only for those wealthy enough to indulge in fantasy, and she would waste no more of her dwindling resources hoping for what would never come. Morning arrived, not with the gentle promise of renewal, but with the grudging grey light of an autumn sky, still heavy from the storm that had raged through the night. And Eleanor woke in her narrow bed to find the rain had ceased, but left its mark upon the world in streaked window panes and the persistent drip of water from the eaves, a melancholy percussion that seemed to mark the passing seconds of a life grown too quiet and too small. She rose and dressed with the efficient movements of a woman who had learned to manage without a lady's maid, fastening the buttons of her dove-grey dress with fingers that did not tremble despite the cold of the room, for she had long ago ceased to waste coal on warming her bedchamber, when the small sitting-room sufficed for both economy and dignity. The dress itself was a study in careful maintenance, its fabric worn soft at the elbows, and its hem let down twice to accommodate fashion's shifting whims, yet it remained respectable, presentable, the uniform of a gentlewoman who refused to advertise her reduced circumstances even as they pressed upon her from every direction. She took stock of her situation as she had done every morning for the past 18 months, cataloguing her resources with the dispassionate precision of a shopkeeper reviewing inventory. Her father dead, her mother gone these 7 years past, her small inheritance dwindling to a sum that would sustain her perhaps another 3 months, if she continued to live with the most stringent economy, and beyond that lay only the charity of her elderly Aunt Harriet, a distant relation who had opened her modest home to Eleanor with genuine kindness, but whose own circumstances were far from comfortable. Eleanor could not, allow herself to become a permanent burden upon a woman who had already given more than duty required, and as she smoothed her chestnut hair before the small mirror above her washstand, she made herself a silent promise with the same fierce determination that had carried her through every humiliation and hardship of the past 2 years. "I will not be a burden," she thought, meeting her own grey eyes in the glass and finding them steady despite everything. "I will find a way, even if that way leads somewhere I never imagined." A knock upon her door interrupted this private catechism, and she opened it to find her aunt's housemaid bearing a letter on a tarnished silver tray, the paper crisp and cream-coloured, and bearing the seal of Mr. Samuel Whitmore, her family's solicitor. The contents, when she broke the seal with fingers that remained admirably steady, requested her presence at his offices that very afternoon regarding what he termed a matter of some delicacy and potential advantage. Words, vague enough to mean anything, and yet carrying an undercurrent of urgency that quickened her pulse despite her determination to expect nothing. She turned back to the mirror and studied her reflection with detachment. The rich chestnut waves of her hair that caught auburn fire when sunlight deigned to appear. The deep grey eyes framed by dark lashes that shifted towards silver when emotion moved her. The small crescent scar at her left eyebrow that she touched now without thinking. And she lifted her chin and practiced the composed expression that had become her armour against a world that had already shown her how quickly everything could be lost. The offices of Mr. Samuel Whitmore occupied a narrow building in a respectable if unfashionable street, and Eleanor climbed the worn stairs with the measured tread of a woman who had learned to expect nothing and thereby protect herself from disappointment. Yet even this hard-won composure could not entirely suppress the flutter of something that might have been hope beneath her breastbone as she considered what matter of delicacy and potential advantage might await her behind the solicitor's door. She had imagined, in the carriage ride through streets still slick with last night's rain, that perhaps some distant relation had remembered her in a will, some forgotten connection of her mother's, who had left behind a modest sum sufficient to purchase another year of independence, another year in which she might find some respectable employment as a governess or companion, and she had rehearsed her gratitude for this imagined bequest with the same care she applied to every interaction, determined that whatever came, she would meet it with dignity intact. What she had not imagined, what she could not have conceived in her most fantastical moments, was the scene that greeted her when Mr. Whitmore's clerk opened the door to the inner office, and she stepped across the threshold to find not one, but 2 men awaiting her. The solicitor rising from behind his desk with an expression of barely concealed nervousness, while by the window stood a figure that seemed to absorb the grey light and transform it into something darker and more commanding, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose presence filled the modest room in a way that made the walls themselves seem to shrink back in deference. Eleanor knew him by reputation before Mr. Whitmore spoke his name, Lord Henry Blackwell, the Duke of Ashworth, a man whose fearsome coldness was whispered about in drawing-rooms she no longer frequented, whose first wife had died in circumstances tragic enough to fuel endless speculation, whose wealth was matched only by his apparent determination to hold himself apart from the society that would have welcomed him with open arms had he deigned to extend his hand. He turned from the window as she entered, and she felt the weight of his gaze like a physical pressure, dark blue eyes that appeared nearly black in the dim light assessing her with an intensity that made her fingers rise unconsciously to touch the crescent scar at her eyebrow, before she caught herself and forced her hand back to her side. Mr. Whitmore was speaking, explaining in halting phrases that his Grace required a wife for reasons of practicality and succession, that the Dowager Duchess's health made the matter of an heir increasingly urgent, that society's expectations demanded he emerge from his long mourning. But Eleanor heard these words as if from a great distance, because the Duke himself had begun to move toward her with the deliberate stride of a man who wasted nothing, not words, nor movement, nor time. And as he drew near, she caught for the first time the scent of him, sandalwood and cedar with an underlying note of leather, a warm, masculine fragrance that seemed entirely at odds with his reputation for ice. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and his voice was low and resonant, a baritone that might have been pleasant had it carried any warmth. "I will speak plainly, as I suspect you would prefer plain speaking to the usual social dissembling. I am offering you a marriage of convenience, my name and my protection and my fortune, in exchange for your presence at my side and the appearance of a proper duchess. And I give you my word, Miss Ashworth, I will never give you cause to regret this arrangement. You will want for nothing. You will be safe. I ask nothing of you but the use of your name beside mine." His jaw tightened as he finished speaking, and Eleanor realized he was waiting for her answer with the rigid stillness of a man bracing for refusal. And in that moment she understood that whatever his reasons for choosing her, reasons Mr. Whitmore had not explained and which she could not begin to fathom, he was offering her the one thing she had ceased to hope for, a future that did not depend upon charity or slow genteel starvation, a life in which she might stand with her spine straight, not from desperate pride, but from genuine security. And though her heart whispered warnings about the dangers of binding herself to a man of ice, her practical mind recognized that love was a luxury she had already forsworn, and that safety, true safety, was worth more than any romantic dream she had long ago abandoned. The question rose to her lips before prudence could restrain it, emerging with a steadiness that surprised her even as she spoke. "Why me, Your Grace?" And she watched his dark blue eyes flicker with something that might have been approval at her directness, before his expression resumed its careful blankness, his voice, when he answered, carrying the same clipped efficiency with which he had delivered his proposal, as though he were discussing the terms of a business arrangement rather than the joining of two lives. "You are well bred, Miss Ashworth. Your family name remains respectable despite your current circumstances. Your reputation is intact, and you are—" Here he paused, and she thought she saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, unlikely to harbor romantic expectations that would complicate what is, at its foundation, a practical arrangement. Eleanor absorbed these words with the same composure she had cultivated through 2 years of whispered pity and averted gazes, understanding that he was offering her honesty rather than flattery, and finding in that honesty a strange kind of respect that the flowery compliments of her former betrothed had never contained. She did not know, could not know, that he had first observed her at a charity concert 6 months prior, had watched her navigate a room full of people who remembered her humiliation with her spine straight and her chin level, had noted the quiet dignity with which she had greeted even those who cut her, and had found himself unable to forget the image of her standing alone by a window with the afternoon light catching the auburn fire in her chestnut hair, while the world that should have embraced her turned its back. What she knew was simpler and more immediate, that the man before her offered safety without pretense, security without the false promise of affection, and that in her current circumstances such an offer was not merely acceptable but miraculous. "I accept, Your Grace," she said, and her voice did not waver, and she extended her hand as she might have done to seal any agreement between equals, a gesture that seemed to surprise him for the space of a heartbeat before he took her hand in his, and the warmth of his palm against hers sent an unexpected current through her that she attributed firmly to relief, and nothing more, though she noticed that his grip lingered a fraction of a second longer than strict propriety demanded before he released her and stepped back with that characteristic tightening of his jaw. The remainder of the meeting passed in a blur of arrangements and dates and settlements that Mr. Whitmore detailed with evident relief. And then Eleanor was in the carriage returning to her aunt's house, and then she was climbing the stairs to her modest room, and then she was alone with the grey evening pressing against her window, and the first distant rumble of thunder heralding another storm. She stood before the small mirror and met her own eyes, grey shifting towards silver in the fading light, and she made herself a promise, with all the fierce determination that had carried her through every trial of the past 2 years. I will not love him. I will be grateful. I will be dutiful. I will be a good wife. But I will not love him. I cannot survive that wound again. Outside, the storm broke with sudden violence, rain lashing the glass and thunder rolling across the sky, and Eleanor pressed her fingers to the crescent scar at her eyebrow, and wondered why her hand still felt warm where his had held it. The carriage rounded the final bend in the drive, and Blackwell Manor rose before her like something from a dream she had never dared to dream, its honey-coloured stone glowing in the slanted autumn light, its windows catching fire from the westering sun, its sheer scope and grandeur so far exceeding anything she had imagined, that Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat, and her fingers tighten involuntarily on the edge of the seat as she tried to comprehend that this impossible place was to be her home. She had prepared herself for wealth, had steeled herself for opulence, but nothing in her experience had equipped her for the reality of approaching an estate that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, its manicured grounds rolling away toward distant woods, its facade presenting a harmony of classical proportions that spoke of generations of careful stewardship and bottomless coffers. The carriage came to a halt before the main entrance, and Eleanor saw them waiting, a line of servants in immaculate livery standing at attention on the steps, their faces carefully neutral as they prepared to receive their new mistress, and at their head an elderly man, whose bearing suggested authority tempered by decades of service, his silver hair gleaming beneath the autumn sky. Henry was there too, having ridden ahead on horseback, and he descended the steps to hand her down from the carriage himself, rather than leaving the task to a footman, his grip firm and brief, his expression unreadable as he said simply, "Welcome to Blackwell Manor, Your Grace." The title still strange on his lips, and stranger still in her ears. The elderly butler, Thomas Hartwell, Henry informed her, who had served the family for 40 years, bowed with grave dignity and murmured his welcome. And then Eleanor was being guided through the entrance hall with its soaring ceiling and marble floors, past portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow her progress, through corridors that twisted and turned until she lost all sense of direction. Henry's low voice pointing out rooms and wings and features of the house with the clipped efficiency she was coming to recognize as his habitual manner. It was in the library that it happened. A vast room lined floor to ceiling with books, their leather spines gleaming in the late afternoon light that poured through tall windows, the air rich with the scent of old pages and beeswax polish. A room so beautiful that Eleanor's attention wandered from the carpet beneath her feet, and she caught her toe on a loose edge and stumbled forward with a small cry of surprise. His hand was on her elbow before she could fall, steadying her with a grip that was warm even through the fabric of her sleeve, and for a moment that seemed to stretch beyond its natural boundaries, she was aware of nothing but the pressure of his fingers and the scent of sandalwood and cedar that surrounded him, and the way his dark blue eyes met hers with an intensity that made her forget to breathe. Then his jaw tightened in that way she had observed before, and he released her abruptly, stepping back as though her touch had burned him. His voice stiff as he said, "The library is yours to use as you wish. I understand you are fond of reading." And she wondered how he knew this, what else he might have noticed about her that she had not realized he was observing. He left her then, to settle into her chambers, and Eleanor stood alone in the library, surrounded by more books than she had ever seen in one place, her hand rising without conscious thought to touch the spot on her elbow. where his warmth still seemed to linger. And she told herself firmly that the flutter beneath her breastbone was merely the natural surprise of a stumble and a catch, merely the disorientation of finding herself in a place so grand it seemed unreal, and certainly not, absolutely not, the first treacherous stirring of something her heart had promised never to feel again. The summons came on the morning of her third day at Blackwell Manor, delivered by Thomas Hartwell with the grave courtesy that seemed to characterize his every interaction, his silver head inclining as he informed her that the Dowager Duchess would be pleased to receive her in the private sitting-room at her earliest convenience, and Eleanor felt her stomach tighten with apprehension, even as she rose from the breakfast table and smoothed her skirts with hands that trembled only slightly, for she had been dreading this meeting since her arrival, had lain awake imagining the cold scrutiny of a woman who must surely resent the stranger her son had installed in her beloved daughter-in-law's place. She followed Thomas through corridors that were becoming marginally less labyrinthine with each passing day, her fingers brushing unconsciously against the crescent scar at her eyebrow as she prepared herself for judgment, for disappointment, for the particular cruelty of a mother defending her son's memory of a perfect first wife against the inadequate replacement who had been chosen for practical reasons rather than love. The sitting-room door opened, and Eleanor stepped inside, and found herself immediately enveloped in the delicate scent of lavender, a fragrance so reminiscent of her own mother's perfume that her throat constricted with unexpected grief. And through the blur of sudden emotion she perceived a woman rising from a chair by the fire. Not the stern matriarch she had imagined, but a handsome woman of perhaps 58 years, whose silver-streaked dark hair framed a face marked by intelligence and warmth, whose eyes were the same striking blue as her son's, but softened by laugh lines, and something that looked remarkably like hope. "So you are Eleanor," the Dowager Duchess said, and her voice carried none of the frost Eleanor had braced herself against, only a keen interest that seemed to take in every detail of the young woman before her, from her simply pinned chestnut hair to her grey eyes to the way she held herself with quiet dignity despite her obvious nervousness. "Come, sit with me. Thomas, the tea, if you please, and let us become acquainted, for I have been most eager to meet the woman who has accomplished what I had begun to fear was impossible." Eleanor sat in the chair indicated, accepting a cup of tea from the service Thomas provided before withdrawing with silent discretion, and she found herself studied with an attention that felt nothing like judgment and everything like assessment, as though Margaret Blackwell were searching for something specific and finding it with each passing moment. "My son has been frozen for 5 years, Margaret said at last, setting down her own cup and leaning forward with an earnestness that caught Eleanor off guard. "Frozen since Catherine died, since the child died, since he convinced himself that caring deeply for anything was a weakness that would destroy him. I had begun to fear he would never thaw, that he would live out his days in that terrible coldness he has wrapped around himself like armor." She paused, and Eleanor saw the grief that still lived in those blue eyes, the mother's anguish at watching her child suffer and being powerless to help. "And then he spoke your name, and I saw something in his eyes I thought had died with Catherine." Eleanor opened her mouth to protest, to explain that their arrangement was practical rather than romantic, but Margaret reached across the small distance between them and took Eleanor's hands in her own. Warm, maternal hands that squeezed with gentle pressure, and the gesture was so achingly familiar, so reminiscent of a comfort Eleanor had not known since her own mother's death, that words failed her entirely. "Give him time, my dear," Margaret said softly, her eyes holding Eleanor's with an intensity that seemed to see past every wall she had built. "The walls he has built are high, but they are not stone. They are ice, and ice, you know, melts." Eleanor left the sitting-room an hour later, with her understanding of Henry Blackwell fundamentally altered, with an unexpected ally in the mother-in-law she had feared, and with the first fragile tendrils of something that felt dangerously like hope taking root in the heart she had sworn to keep protected. The gardens of Blackwell Manor revealed themselves to Eleanor on a morning of rare autumn sunshine, the kind of crystalline brightness that seemed to apologize for all the grey days that had preceded it. And she found herself walking the gravel paths with something approaching contentment as she breathed in the crisp air scented with dying roses and damp earth, and the particular sweetness of leaves beginning their slow surrender to the season. She had been at the manor for a week now, and the initial overwhelming strangeness of her circumstances had begun to soften into something more bearable, the vast halls feeling less like a museum and more like a place where she might, in time, belong. And so she walked with her shawl wrapped close against the morning chill, and allowed herself to simply observe the careful beauty that surrounded her, the sculptured hedges and the ornamental trees and the flower beds that, while immaculately tended, struck her with their curious uniformity. "Roses and chrysanthemums and dahlias," she murmured to herself, pausing beside a bed of late-blooming flowers that nodded in the gentle breeze. "All quite lovely, of course. But where are the lilies? There ought to be lilies, the white ones edged in pink that my mother grew. Stargazers, she called them, and the scent of them would fill our whole garden in summer." And she did not realize that she was speaking aloud, did not notice the tall figure who had paused on the path behind her, did not see the way Henry Blackwell's expression shifted almost imperceptibly as he listened to words she thought she was saying only to herself. What she did notice with startling suddenness was the enormous grey shape hurtling toward her across the lawn. Brutus, Henry's wolfhound, a creature of such magnificent size that he seemed more wolf than dog, and he was bounding toward her with his tongue lolling and his tail whipping, and an enthusiasm so absolute that Eleanor had no time to brace herself before the impact. She went backward into the hedge, with a cry of surprise, branches crackling beneath her weight, leaves showering around her, and Brutus, apparently delighted by this development, proceeded to thrust his massive head into her lap and cover her face with enthusiastic licks, while she sputtered and flailed and tried without success to extricate herself from the shrubbery. And then she heard it, a sound so unexpected that she stopped struggling entirely. The sound of Henry Blackwell laughing, a real laugh, rich and warm and startled out of him before he could catch it. And when she looked up through the curtain of her dishevelled hair and the leaves that clung to her like strange ornaments, she saw his face transformed by mirth. The stern lines softened, his dark blue eyes bright with an amusement he could not hide. The absurdity of her position struck her then, and she began to laugh too, helplessly, the sound bubbling up from somewhere deep within her chest, and for a moment that seemed suspended outside of time, they were simply two people sharing in the ridiculous joy of an undignified moment. Then silence fell between them, sudden and startling, and Eleanor saw the surprise in his own eyes, as though he had not recognized the sound of his own laughter. "I had forgotten what that sounded like," he said quietly, almost to himself, and she understood he meant not her laughter, but his own. He stepped forward and reached toward her hair, where a particularly stubborn oak leaf had lodged itself near her temple, and she felt the warmth of his fingers brush against her skin. And then he pulled his hand back abruptly, his jaw tightening in that familiar way, and instead gestured vaguely toward her head. "There is a leaf," he said. His voice returned to its usual clipped register, and Eleanor reached up to remove it herself, her fingers trembling slightly as she plucked leaves and twigs from her chestnut waves, and neither of them spoke of what had just passed between them. But she saw him glance back at her twice as he walked away with Brutus at his heels, and she thought that perhaps Margaret had been right after all. Perhaps ice could melt, one unexpected moment at a time. The invitation to accompany Henry on his rounds to the tenant farms came on a morning 2 weeks after Eleanor's arrival, delivered not as a command, but as a question posed over breakfast with the careful neutrality that characterized so much of his speech, and she accepted with an eagerness she hoped did not show too plainly on her face, for she had begun to chafe against the gilded confines of the manor, and longed to understand the full scope of the world she had entered through marriage. The carriage ride was largely silent, Henry reviewing papers, and Eleanor watching the countryside roll past in shades of amber and russet. But it was a companionable silence rather than an uncomfortable one, and when they arrived at the first cottage, she noted how the tenant farmer, a weathered man named Amos Fletcher, removed his cap and bowed with respect, but also with a certain wariness in his eyes, as though he were addressing a force of nature rather than a man. This pattern repeated at each stop: the careful deference, the measured words, the way the farmers' wives curtsied low and kept their children close, and Eleanor observed it all with growing curiosity, wondering how the man who had laughed so freely in the garden could inspire such caution in those who depended upon his goodwill. The afternoon light had begun to slant golden through the clouds when they reached the final cottage, where the smell of hay and wood smoke hung thick in the air, and a young farmer named Samuel Barton stood with his cap crushed nervously in his hands, while his wife bobbed endless curtsies. And it was here that Eleanor noticed the small figure half hidden behind her father's legs. A girl of perhaps 4 years, with wheat-coloured braids and enormous brown eyes, fixed upon Henry with unmistakable terror. Eleanor had stepped aside to examine a climbing rose that grew against the cottage wall, giving Henry space to conduct his business. And so she stood at an angle where she could observe without being observed herself, and what she witnessed in the next moments would alter something fundamental in her understanding of the man she had married. Henry noticed the frightened child. Of course he noticed, for Eleanor was beginning to realize that very little escaped his attention, and rather than ignore her discomfort or allow the adults to manage it, he did something that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. He knelt, lowering his considerable height until he was level with the trembling girl, and his voice when he spoke was so gentle, so utterly transformed from its usual clipped efficiency, that Eleanor might not have recognized it if she had not seen his lips move. "There's nothing to fear from me, little one," he said softly, and from his coat pocket he produced a small wrapped sweet, offering it on his open palm, as one might offer a treat to a skittish creature. "I'm not nearly as frightening as I look." The child, Bessie her mother called her, hesitated for a long moment, then reached out with a tiny hand and took the sweet, and when she giggled at the Duke's conspiratorial wink, Henry smiled, truly smiled, the expression transforming his stern features into something warm and almost boyish. And Eleanor pressed her hand to her heart and turned away before he could see the tears that had sprung unbidden to her eyes, understanding now with perfect clarity that the coldness the world saw was armor, only armor, and beneath it beat a heart capable of extraordinary tenderness. The morning light fell soft and grey through the tall windows of Eleanor's private sitting-room, that gentle illumination of early autumn that seemed to wrap the world in quietude, and she had just settled herself at the small writing desk with the intention of composing a letter to her aunt, when the door opened and Thomas Hartwell entered, bearing a crystal vase filled with flowers that made her heart stop utterly in her chest. They were lilies, stargazer lilies, their broad white petals blushed with pink at the edges, their stamens heavy with rust-coloured pollen, and the scent of them reached her before she could form words, that sweet and heady fragrance that she had not encountered since childhood, since the garden behind the house where her mother had knelt in the dirt, with her sleeves rolled up and her face turned toward the sun. "His Grace has given orders that fresh lilies are to be placed in your sitting-room each morning, madam," Thomas said, setting the vase upon the table near the window where the light would catch the delicate petals, and his aged face bore an expression of quiet satisfaction as he continued. "He was most particular about the variety, white, with pink edges. He said you mentioned once that they reminded you of your mother's garden." Eleanor could not speak for a long moment. Her fingers pressed to her lips as she stared at the flowers that seemed impossible, miraculous, a fragment of her lost world, somehow restored to her in this new one. And when she finally found her voice, it emerged rough with emotion she could not entirely suppress. "Thank you, Thomas," she managed, and the butler inclined his silver head with the particular dignity that characterized his every movement before withdrawing and leaving her alone with the lilies and the memories they conjured. Her mother's hands, her mother's laugh, the way the summer garden had smelled when the stargazers bloomed in profusion along the back wall. She barely remembered mentioning them, had spoken the words to herself in the garden that morning. With Brutus, had not known anyone was listening, and yet Henry had heard, had remembered, had acted, and the knowledge of it bloomed in her chest like the flowers themselves, warm and startling, and impossible to ignore. At dinner that evening she waited until the soup had been cleared and the fish course laid before them, the candlelight dancing across the polished mahogany and the crystal and the silver, before she spoke. "The lilies," she said quietly, and watched his hand pause almost imperceptibly over his wine-glass. "They are beautiful. I wanted to thank you." Henry's dark blue eyes met hers for a moment that stretched like honey, something unguarded flickering in their depths, and then he looked away toward the window, where the evening sky was fading from rose to violet. "The gardens needed variety," he said, his voice gruff, dismissive. But she had learned to read him now, had seen behind the armor to the tenderness it concealed, and she understood that this was simply his way, to give without fanfare, to care without confession, to show rather than speak. She touched the crescent scar at her eyebrow and allowed herself, for the first time, to feel something that might have been hope. Sleep would not come to Eleanor that night, though she had lain in her bed for hours, watching the shadows shift across the ceiling as clouds drifted past the moon, and finally she rose and wrapped herself in her shawl and slipped into the corridor, drawn by some restlessness she could not name, to wander the sleeping house that had become her home these 4 weeks past. Blackwell Manor felt different in the darkness, its grand proportions somehow both diminished and magnified by the moonlight that fell in silver pools through the tall windows, and Eleanor moved through the silence like a ghost herself, her bare feet soundless on the thick carpets, her fingers trailing along the wainscoting as she passed through rooms she was only beginning to know. She had not intended to find herself in the portrait gallery, had not even realized her wandering had carried her to this wing of the house, but when she turned a corner and saw the long hall stretching before her, its walls lined with gilt-framed faces of Blackwells long dead, she paused at the threshold and felt the weight of centuries pressing against her chest. It was then that she saw him, and her heart ceased its beating entirely. Henry stood before a portrait at the far end of the gallery, his tall figure silhouetted against the moonlight that poured through the window behind him, and even from this distance Eleanor could see that something was terribly wrong. His shoulders, those broad shoulders that carried the weight of his title and his lands and his responsibilities with such apparent ease, were bowed as though beneath an invisible burden, and his hand was pressed flat against the ornate frame of the portrait before him, with a desperation that made her throat tighten. She should have retreated, should have slipped away before he sensed her presence, but she could not move, could not look away from this glimpse of private anguish that he would never willingly have shown her, and so she stood frozen in the shadows, and watched as the Duke of Ashworth grieved alone in the moonlit dark. The portrait showed a woman of delicate beauty, golden-haired and serene, holding an infant swaddled in white against her breast, and Eleanor understood with sudden, terrible clarity that this was Catherine, the wife who had died, the son who had never drawn breath outside the womb, and that Henry's hand pressed to the frame was reaching for something he could never touch again. He has not healed, Eleanor thought, her own hand rising to press against her heart as though she could contain the ache that bloomed there. He has only hidden. She retreated then, silent as she had come, and when she reached her own chamber, she sat upon the edge of her bed and wept. Not for herself, not for her own losses, but for the man who had given her lilies and laughter and safety while carrying such devastation locked within his chest. And she understood now, with a clarity that frightened her, that the walls she had built around her own heart were crumbling, that she wanted not merely to live beside him, but to reach him, to offer him the same tenderness he had shown her, to help him tear down the fortress of ice he had constructed around his grief. And the wanting of it was terrifying, because it meant she had already begun to love him. The carriage wheels rattled over the cobblestones of London as Eleanor sat rigid against the velvet squabs, her gloved hands folded in her lap with a composure that belied the frantic beating of her heart. And she could feel Henry's presence beside her, like a flame in the winter darkness, his warmth and his scent, that familiar sandalwood and cedar that she had come to associate with safety, wrapping around her as surely as the magnificent silk gown that draped her figure in cascades of deep sapphire blue. He had insisted upon the gown, upon the sapphires at her throat and ears, upon the delicate pins that held her chestnut waves in an elaborate arrangement that the lady's maid had spent an hour perfecting, and when Eleanor had protested that such finery was excessive, he had merely said, his voice carrying that clipped efficiency she now recognized as his armor, that it was appropriate for a duchess to dress as one, nothing more. But she had seen the way his dark blue eyes had softened when she descended the staircase, had caught the almost imperceptible catch in his breath before he schooled his features into their customary severity. Now, as the carriage slowed and the sounds of music and laughter filtered through the winter night, he leaned close enough that his breath stirred the curls at her temple and spoke in that low voice that seemed to resonate in her very bones. "You have nothing to prove to anyone here. Remember that." Eleanor turned to meet his gaze, finding in those midnight depths something that might have been concern, might have been pride, might have been something else entirely that she dared not name, and she nodded once before the carriage door opened, and the footman handed her down into the blazing light of the Kensington townhouse. The ballroom swallowed them in a tide of candlelight and music, hundreds of tapers glittering in crystal chandeliers that cast dancing shadows across the silk-papered walls, and Eleanor felt the weight of every gaze that turned toward them as Henry guided her forward with his hand pressed warm and steady against the small of her back, proprietary, protective, a silent declaration that she belonged at his side. The whispers followed them like a trailing perfume. But as Eleanor listened, she realized with dawning wonder that these were not the whispers she remembered from 2 years ago, not the pitying murmurs and cruel speculation that had followed her humiliation. These were whispers of envy, of admiration, of grudging respect for the woman who had risen from disgrace to duchess. She was no longer poor Miss Ashworth with her dowry of debts. She was Her Grace, the Duchess of Ashworth, and the transformation dizzied her even as it steadied something deep within her chest. Margaret caught her eye from across the room and inclined her silver head with a smile of quiet satisfaction, and Eleanor felt herself begin to breathe more easily, felt the tension in her shoulders unknot. And then she saw him. Clarence Pemberton stood near the refreshment table with his wife Viola on his arm, her brittle beauty sharp as glass in the candlelight. And when his pale blue eyes found Eleanor across the crowded room, his expression shifted from surprise to something calculating, something hungry, and Eleanor's hand rose unconsciously to touch the crescent scar at her eyebrow as the past and present collided in her chest. The moment Henry stepped away to speak with an elderly earl, who had claimed his attention with some matter of parliamentary business, Eleanor felt the shift in the air like a change in pressure before a storm, and she knew even before she turned her head that Clarence Pemberton was approaching, his golden hair gleaming in the candlelight, his pale blue eyes fixed upon her with an expression that made her skin crawl with the memory of humiliation. And yet she did not retreat, did not lower her gaze, but stood her ground with her spine straight and her chin level as he came to stand before her with that smile she had once thought charming, and now recognized as the shallow mask it had always been. "Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of easy possession, as though 2 years had not passed, as though he had not shattered her before 100 witnesses, as though she were still the desperate girl with nothing to offer but her heart. "How well you look, though I confess I am not surprised, given your remarkable change in circumstances." She said nothing, merely watched him with grey eyes that had learned to reveal nothing, and her silence seemed to unsettle him, for he pressed on with increasing boldness. "I suppose you owe me thanks, really, when one considers the matter properly. After all, had I not released you from our understanding, you would never have caught the eye of Ashworth. And look at you now, dripping in sapphires and silk." The cruelty of it stole her breath. That he could stand before her and claim credit for her happiness. That he could rewrite history to cast himself as her benefactor rather than her destroyer. And her hand rose unconsciously toward the scar at her eyebrow before she caught herself and forced it back to her side. And she was drawing breath to deliver a response that would have been cold and dignified and utterly inadequate when she felt, rather than heard Henry's return, felt the warmth of him at her back, smelled sandalwood and cedar, and heard his voice cut through the air like a blade forged of winter ice. "You will address my wife as your grace, and you will never speak to her again with such presumption." The silence that fell around them was absolute, the nearby guests freezing mid-conversation, champagne glasses suspended halfway to lips, and Eleanor watched Clarence's face drain of colour, before a sneer twisted his handsome features into something ugly as he said, "Come now, Ashworth, there's no need for such formality. I knew her when she was nobody, after all." Henry stepped forward, positioning his broad frame between Eleanor and the man who had once broken her. And when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to a register so low and dangerous that Eleanor felt it vibrate in her very bones. "You knew nothing. You saw a dowry and found it wanting. I saw a woman of extraordinary worth and had the sense to claim her. The failure of perception was entirely yours, Lord Pemberton. Now remove yourself from my wife's presence before I remove you myself." His hand found hers behind his back, his fingers threading through hers with a warmth that anchored her, as Clarence's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, as Viola watched from a distance with an expression of bitter vindication, as the whispers erupted around them in a tide of shocked delight. And then Clarence retreated, backing away with what dignity he could muster, and Eleanor stood in the wreckage of her old shame, with her hand clasped in her husband's, and felt something crack open in her chest that might have been the last of her defences falling. The carriage swallowed them in darkness as it pulled away from the blazing lights of the Kensington townhouse, the rattle of wheels over cobblestones filling the silence that stretched between them like a living thing. And Eleanor sat with her hands trembling in her lap, her heart so full of words that none of them could find their way to her lips. For how did one thank a man for restoring what she had thought lost forever, for standing before the architect of her humiliation and declaring her worth in a voice that brooked no argument, for choosing her so publicly and so fiercely that the whispers which had once condemned her now sang a different tune entirely? The cold night air seeped through the carriage walls despite the velvet and the furs, but Eleanor felt only warmth, the lingering heat of Henry's hand in hers, the echo of his voice cutting through Clarence's cruelty like a blade through silk. And when she finally found her voice, it emerged smaller than she intended, roughened by emotion she could not quite contain. "Thank you, Henry. What you did in there. What you said." But he shook his head, his jaw tight in the shadows, his dark blue eyes fixed on some point beyond the frosted window, as he replied with that clipped efficiency that she now recognized as his retreat from feeling. "He had no right to speak to you that way." Eleanor pressed forward, despite the warning in his tone, despite the way his shoulders had stiffened, because something had broken open in her chest, and she could not simply let this moment pass unmarked. "You didn't have to defend me like that. Our arrangement doesn't require—" And he turned then, turning so sharply that she caught her breath, his voice rough as gravel, rough as something dragged up from depths he kept carefully hidden. "Our arrangement has nothing to do with it." The words hung between them in the darkness, heavy with meaning neither of them seemed prepared to examine, and Eleanor felt her heart beating against her ribs like a caged bird seeking freedom as the carriage rattled on through the winter night, as the silence grew thick with all the things they were not saying, as she breathed in sandalwood and cedar and wondered when that scent had become synonymous with safety, with home, with something perilously close to love. When the carriage finally halted before Blackwell Manor, its windows glowing with welcoming light against the cold darkness, Henry descended first and turned to hand her down, and his fingers closed around hers with a warmth that seemed to burn through their gloves, holding her steady as she stepped onto the frozen ground, and then holding still, holding longer than necessary, his thumb brushing once across her knuckles in a gesture so small and so deliberate that it stole her breath entirely. "You are worth defending, Eleanor," he said, his voice low and rough and stripped of all its careful armor, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her knees weaken beneath her magnificent sapphire gown. "I would have you know that." And then he released her hand and walked away into the house, his broad shoulders disappearing through the doorway before she could find words to answer, leaving her standing alone in the winter cold, with her heart cracking open, and the terrifying, exhilarating certainty that whatever existed between them had just become something far more dangerous than any arrangement. The library called to her in the days that followed, its tall windows and leather-bound volumes becoming a refuge she sought with increasing frequency, and Eleanor told herself it was merely the comfort of books that drew her there each afternoon, when the grey winter light fell soft through the frost-etched glass, told herself that the worn carpet where she had once stumbled held no particular significance, that the faint lingering scent of sandalwood and cedar was merely a trick of memory, that she did not pause each time she entered to let her gaze drift to the spot where his hand had caught her elbow and held her steady in more ways than one. She was not convincing, not even to herself, and she knew it with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her as she wandered the shelves one afternoon, trailing her fingers across spines embossed in gold and silver, breathing in the familiar perfume of old pages and beeswax polish that had become as dear to her as any garden in bloom. It was on the small table beside the settee that she found it, a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, its leather cover softened by years of handling, left open as though someone had been reading recently and had been called away mid-thought. And Eleanor's heart stuttered in her chest as she lifted the volume and recognized the bold, decisive hand that had underlined certain passages, the ink slightly faded, but unmistakably his. Her fingers trembled as she turned the pages, finding annotation after annotation in that familiar script, until she reached Sonnet 116, and felt the breath leave her body entirely. For there, underlined with such force that the pen had nearly torn through the paper, were the words, "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove." She traced the underlined words with her fingertip, feeling the slight indentation where he had pressed so hard, and something cracked open in her chest, some last desperate wall she had built against hope, because these were not the markings of a man who felt nothing, not the private thoughts of a husband who wanted only an arrangement, and she stood there in the amber afternoon light, with tears pricking at her eyes, and her hand pressed flat against the page, as though she could reach through the words to touch the heart that had chosen them. She did not hear Margaret enter, did not notice the Dowager Duchess until that gentle voice said softly from the doorway, "I wondered when you would find that." And Eleanor looked up with her expression utterly unguarded, her grey eyes bright with unshed tears and dawning hope, the book clutched to her chest like a talisman against all the fears that had kept her heart in chains. Margaret said nothing more, offered no explanation or commentary, but her smile, warm and knowing, and filled with a quiet triumph, spoke volumes that needed no words, and Eleanor understood in that moment that she was not the only one who had been waiting for the ice to melt. The days folded into one another like pages of a book read too quickly to savour, and Eleanor found herself suspended in a strange and exquisite limbo, where every moment with Henry became both treasure and torment. Breakfast taken together in the morning-room where winter light fell pale and silver through frost-laced windows, their conversation easy enough on the surface, yet charged beneath with currents neither acknowledged. Afternoons in the library where they read in companionable silence, she on the settee with her novel and he in the leather chair by the fire with his correspondence, and she would glance up to find his dark blue eyes already upon her, only to watch him look away, his jaw tightening in that familiar gesture of retreat. Evenings before the great hearth in the drawing-room, where the flames cast dancing shadows across his stern features, and she traced the lines of his profile with her gaze while pretending to focus on her embroidery, memorizing the way firelight softened the hard planes of his face, the way his hands, those large, warm hands she dreamed of now, turned the pages of his book with such deliberate care. The household staff moved around them like benevolent ghosts, Thomas Hartwell appearing with tea at precisely the right moments, the maids ensuring fires blazed in every room against the deepening cold that pressed against the windows and turned the gardens to sculptures of ice and silence, and Eleanor existed within this cocoon of warmth, while something far more dangerous than winter's chill worked its way through every defense she had built. She caught herself leaning toward him when he spoke, caught herself breathing deeper when he passed close enough for her to drink in that scent of sandalwood and cedar, caught herself lying awake at night with her hand pressed to her racing heart, and the memory of his voice saying, "You are worth defending, Eleanor," echoing through her like a bell that would not stop ringing. And it was on a morning when she stood at the window, watching him cross the frozen garden toward the stables, his dark coat stark against the white landscape, that the truth she had been fleeing finally caught her and would not let go. Her hand rose to touch the small crescent scar at her eyebrow, that unconscious gesture of vulnerability, and she whispered the words aloud to the empty room, as though speaking them might somehow make them less terrifying. "I love him. God help me, I love him." The admission hung in the cold air, damning and undeniable, and she remembered with painful clarity the promise she had made to herself in that shabby rented room while the storm raged outside. "I will not love him. I cannot survive that wound again." And she almost laughed at the foolish girl who had believed she could choose what her heart would feel. But the laughter died before it reached her lips, replaced by something harder and brighter, something that felt almost like courage, because Eleanor Blackwell had survived humiliation and loss and the slow death of every dream she had ever cherished, and she knew now that she could not survive this endless waiting, this exquisite torture of almost, this living beside a man she loved without ever knowing if he might love her in return. She would find a way to reach him, she decided, her spine straightening with the same quiet dignity that had carried her through every storm, even if it meant risking everything, because she had been rejected before and lived. But she could not bear to spend a lifetime wondering what might have been, if only she had been brave enough to try. The storm broke over Blackwell Manor with a fury that seemed to mirror the tempest within Eleanor's breast, thunder rolling across the darkened sky like a herald of reckoning as she descended the stairs, with her heart pounding so violently she could feel its rhythm in her throat, in her fingertips, in the very marrow of her bones, and she knew before she reached the library door that she would find him there. knew it with the same certainty that had guided her through every moment of this strange and wondrous journey from despair to something she had never dared name until this morning, when the word had escaped her lips and changed everything. The library glowed with firelight when she entered, flames dancing in the great hearth, and casting shifting shadows across the leather-bound spines that had witnessed so much between them. And Henry stood at the window with his back to her, watching the lightning split the sky, his broad shoulders tense beneath the fine wool of his coat, and Eleanor paused in the doorway to drink in the sight of him one last time before she risked everything. This man who had caught her when she stumbled, who had remembered her mother's flowers, who had defended her honor before all of London, who had underlined sonnets about love that does not alter with a hand that trembled with feeling, he refused to speak. "Henry," she said, and her voice emerged steadier than she had any right to expect, "I need to speak with you." And she watched him turn, watched his dark blue eyes find hers across the room, watched his jaw tighten with that familiar gesture of bracing for impact, and she understood that he expected bad news, expected her to tell him she was leaving, perhaps, or that she found their arrangement insufficient, and the irony of it nearly undid her. She crossed to where the firelight fell brightest, her hand rising unconsciously to touch the small crescent scar at her eyebrow, and she made herself hold his gaze as she spoke the words that would either save her or shatter her entirely. "I promised myself I would not love you. I have failed. I love you, Henry. I know that was not part of our arrangement, and I ask nothing in return. But I could not bear to keep it hidden any longer." The silence that followed stretched between them like a held breath, broken only by the crack of thunder and the wild beating of her heart. And she watched something shift in his expression, something crumbling, breaking, falling away. And then he was moving toward her with purpose in every stride, crossing the distance between them as though he could not bear another moment of separation. And his hands, those large, warm hands she had dreamed of, rose to cradle her face with a tenderness that stole the breath from her lungs. "You think you have failed," he said, and his voice was rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before, raw and unguarded and fierce with feeling. "Eleanor, I have loved you since the moment I saw you stand with your spine straight and your chin raised while the world tried to break you. I chose you because I could not bear to see you belong to anyone else. I told myself it was practical. I lied. I have wanted you, all of you, from the very beginning." His scent surrounded her, sandalwood and cedar and the leather of the saddle, and she felt tears spill down her cheeks as his thumbs brushed them away with heartbreaking gentleness, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to barely a murmur. "Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds. My love for you will not alter, Eleanor. It cannot." And then his mouth found hers, and the storm outside raged on unheeded, as Eleanor Blackwell discovered that some promises were made to be broken, and some walls were built only so that the right person might tear them down. The kiss deepened, and the world beyond the library walls ceased to exist, and when at last they drew apart, Eleanor found herself trembling, not with fear, but with the overwhelming relief of a burden finally set down after years of carrying its weight alone. And Henry's hands remained on her face, his thumbs tracing the paths her tears had taken, as though he could not bear to stop touching her now that he had finally allowed himself to begin. "I need you to understand," he said, and his voice was low and halting, each word costing him something precious. "Catherine, I loved her, and when she died, when our son died, I believed I had used up whatever capacity for love I possessed. I believed that caring so deeply had been my punishment, and that the only way to survive was to never care again." Eleanor reached up to cover his hands with her own, feeling the thin scar across his right palm and she whispered, "I know. I saw you in the portrait gallery that night. I saw your grief, Henry, and I understood." His eyes widened with surprise, and then softened with something like gratitude that she had witnessed his pain and chosen to stay. And Eleanor found herself speaking too, the words pouring out like water finally released from behind a dam. "Clarence told me I was not enough, that without my dowry I was nothing worth having. And when my father died 3 months later, I believed it was the shame that killed him, the shame I had brought upon our family by being so foolish as to believe myself loved." Henry's jaw tightened, and his hands slid from her face to pull her against his chest, and she pressed her cheek to the fine wool of his coat and breathed in the scent of sandalwood and cedar that had become the very definition of safety. "You were never the fool in that story," he said fiercely against her hair. He looked at you and saw only numbers in a ledger, and I looked at you and saw everything I had been afraid to want." They stood entwined, as the thunder rolled away into the distance, and then Henry drew back just enough to reach into his coat pocket and withdraw a small velvet box that he pressed into her hands with an expression of such tender vulnerability that Eleanor's heart clenched. "I have been carrying this for weeks," he admitted, "waiting for courage I was not certain I possessed. Open it." Her fingers trembled as she lifted the lid to reveal a delicate gold locket on a fine chain, and she opened it, expecting emptiness, only to find a miniature portrait so exquisitely rendered that the breath left her body entirely. Her mother's face gazed back at her, captured in perfect detail, the warm brown eyes and gentle smile Eleanor had feared she was beginning to forget. "I wanted you to have her near," Henry said softly. "You speak of her so rarely, but when you do, your whole face changes. She must have been remarkable to have raised you." Eleanor could not speak through the tears that overwhelmed her, and Henry gathered her close as she wept against his chest, his arms a fortress around her grief and joy alike. And when at last she raised her face to his, the kiss that followed was different from the first, slower, deeper, a promise sealed rather than a confession made. The fire crackled low as he led her from the library to his private chambers, and the storm that had raged so fiercely began to break apart beyond the windows. Clouds parting to reveal stars scattered across the clearing sky like diamonds strewn on velvet, and Eleanor surrendered to the warmth of his hands and the tenderness of his touch and understood at last that she had been wrong about everything. This was not a wound she must survive, but a healing she had been waiting for all her life. And as the final distant thunder faded into silence, she thought of the frightened girl who had promised never to love again and smiled against Henry's lips, grateful beyond measure that some promises were made to be broken. The grand ballroom of the Ashworth London townhouse blazed with the light of 1,000 candles on the night Eleanor made her first appearance as a woman truly loved, and she felt the weight of every gaze that turned toward them as Henry led her through the glittering crowd, with his hand resting at the small of her back, in a gesture that spoke of possession and pride and something far deeper than the arrangement that had first bound them together. And she knew without needing to look that his dark blue eyes softened each time they found her face, because she could feel the warmth of his attention like sunlight after a long winter. And indeed, winter it had been. Years of it, cold and lonely and stripped of hope. But now spring whispered through her veins and showed itself in the flush of her cheeks and the quiet confidence of her bearing as she moved through the crowd in a gown of deep sapphire silk that caught the candlelight like water-catching moonbeams, finer than anything she had ever worn, and finer still than the pale pink confection Lady Viola Pemberton wore across the room with such brittle desperation. The locket rested warm against Eleanor's throat, her mother's portrait pressed close to her heart. And when Henry's fingers interlaced with hers in full view of the assembled company, a gesture so unprecedented that she heard the sharp intake of breath from nearby matrons, she tilted her head slightly to the left and smiled at him with all the joy she had once believed herself incapable of feeling. Margaret stood near the refreshment table with Lady Henrietta Thornton, the Dowager Duchess's oldest friend, and Eleanor heard her mother-in-law's voice carry with deliberate clarity across the space between them. "I told her the ice would melt. I did not expect it to become a river." And the warmth in Margaret's tone wrapped around Eleanor like an embrace as she turned to meet the older woman's knowing gaze, and found there a satisfaction so complete it bordered on smugness. The whispers that followed Eleanor now were nothing like the cruel murmurs that had haunted her 2 years past. These were whispers of admiration, of envy, of wonder at the transformation of the cold Duke and his practical bride into something that looked remarkably like a love match. And Eleanor let them wash over her like music as Henry drew her onto the dance floor and held her closer than propriety strictly allowed, his breath warm against her temple as he murmured words meant only for her. Across the ballroom she glimpsed Clarence Pemberton standing rigid beside his wife, his golden hair dulled and his handsome face grown haggard with the particular exhaustion of a man who has gotten exactly what he deserved, and Viola's beautiful features twisted with a bitterness that aged her beyond her years, as she watched Eleanor sweep past in the arms of a duke who looked at his duchess as though she were the only woman in the world. And Eleanor felt no triumph at their misery, only a distant pity for two people who had looked at ledgers instead of souls, and found themselves bankrupt in all the ways that mattered, while she, the disgraced Miss Ashworth, who had once stood alone in a ballroom with whispers erupting around her, had somehow stumbled into a fortune beyond counting. She had been chosen, truly chosen, and the man who had chosen her was even now pressing a kiss to her gloved fingers, with a smile that transformed his stern face into something breathtakingly beautiful, and Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that the best was only beginning. 5 summers had painted Blackwell Manor in colours Eleanor could never have imagined during those grey autumn days when she had first arrived as a bride of convenience, with her heart locked away behind walls she had believed impenetrable. And now she stood at the edge of the garden where the gravel path gave way to soft grass, and watched her son William chase his younger sister Catherine through the very hedge that had once sent her tumbling into leaves and laughter, and the first crack in her husband's armour, the children's delighted shrieks rising into the warm afternoon air, like music composed specifically for her joy. And she pressed her hand to her chest, where the locket rested, as it always did, her mother's portrait warm against her skin, and felt the tears prick at her eyes, not from sorrow, but from a gratitude so profound it sometimes stole her breath entirely. The gardens had been transformed in these 5 years, every bed now overflowing with stargazer lilies that nodded their white and pink heads in the gentle breeze, their sweet fragrance perfuming the air until the entire estate seemed wrapped in the scent of her mother's memory. And Eleanor knew that Henry had ordered them planted everywhere, not because he had forgotten her casual mention of them in that first autumn, but because he had remembered, because he always remembered, because showing her that she was cherished through 1,000 quiet actions was simply the language in which he spoke his love. She felt him before she heard his footsteps, that awareness of his presence that had grown only stronger with each passing year, and then his arm slid around her waist and drew her back against the solid warmth of his chest, and she leaned into him with the ease of a woman who had learned at last what it meant to be safe. On the terrace behind them, Margaret sat in her favourite chair, with Thomas Hartwell standing at respectful attention nearby, and Eleanor heard the Dowager Duchess speak in that carrying voice that had never lost its sharpness, despite the silver threading through her hair. "She saved him," Margaret said quietly, and Thomas inclined his silver head with the gravity of a man who had witnessed the transformation from its very beginning, and replied, "They saved each other, Your Grace." They saved each other. Henry's hand found Eleanor's where it rested on the locket, his fingers warm and familiar as they covered hers, and he turned her gently in his arms until she faced him, until she could see the way the summer light caught the deep blue of his eyes and softened them to something like the sky reflected in still water. "What are you thinking?" he asked, and his voice was low and tender, the voice he used only for her and the children. And Eleanor touched the small, crescent scar at her eyebrow, that old habit she had never quite broken, before she answered, "That I almost didn't say yes, that I almost let fear choose for me." Henry kissed her temple with the reverent gentleness that still made her heart flutter after 5 years and 2 children, and countless quiet evenings in the library, where their story had truly begun. And when he spoke, his breath was warm against her skin. "But you didn't, Eleanor. You chose." The twilight settled over Blackwell Manor like a benediction as Eleanor climbed the stairs with the particular contentment of a woman who had tucked 2 sleeping children into their beds and pressed kisses to foreheads still flushed with the exertions of a summer afternoon, and she knew before she reached the library door that she would find Henry there, because she had learned the rhythms of him, as surely as she had learned the rhythms of her own heart. And indeed, when she pushed open the door, he was seated on the settee before the windows, where the last amber light of evening poured through the glass like honey, and in his hands rested the worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, with its cracked leather spine and its pages soft from years of turning. The same book she had discovered on that winter afternoon, when she had first begun to understand that the man she had married was not the cold creature the world believed him to be, but something far more tender and far more wounded, and far more capable of love than she had ever dared to hope. He looked up at her approach, and his dark blue eyes, those eyes that had once seemed nearly black with reserve, but now held depths of warmth she could lose herself in, softened in that way they always did when she entered a room, and he lifted his arm in silent invitation, and she went to him as she always did, settling into the curve of his body with her head against his shoulder and his arm drawing her close, and the scent of sandalwood and cedar wrapped around her like a homecoming as she breathed him in and felt the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. The house was quiet around them, that particular summer evening quiet that held within it the echoes of children's laughter and the promise of more laughter to come. And Eleanor found herself thinking of another evening 5 years past, when she had sat alone in a rented room while rain lashed the windows and thunder rolled across a grey sky, when she had believed herself broken beyond repair and had promised herself she would never love again because she could not survive another wound, and she wished with a sudden fierce tenderness that she could reach back through the years and take that frightened girl by the hand and tell her, hold on, the best is coming, the very best is coming, and it will be more than you ever imagined, and all you must do is be brave enough to choose." Henry pressed a kiss to her hair, and she tilted her head to look up at him, and he smiled, that rare and beautiful smile that had once been locked away behind walls of ice, but now appeared with a frequency that still made her catch her breath, and she knew that every moment of sorrow had led her here, to this library, to this man, to this life overflowing with more joy than her wounded heart had ever believed possible. And so, dear listener, their story finds its rest, not an ending, but a continuing, for love, true love, does not conclude, but deepens and grows until it becomes the very air one breathes. And Eleanor Blackwell, Duchess of Ashworth, learned that the heart is braver than we know, that walls of ice can melt, and that sometimes the most practical choice becomes the most passionate one. And may you too find the courage to choose and to be chosen. And thank you for walking this path with us.